The movie begins on an island covered with thick snow and trees. A military veteran named Martin is cautiously walking through the snow. Martin can hear a dog barking at some distance. Suddenly, Martin hears what sounds like the dog being attacked and assassinated. He carefully walks toward the sound with a rifle in hand. After a little walk, he sees a trail of blood following the deceased body of the dog. All of a sudden, Martin hears someone walking behind the bushes. He seems terrified and anxious, and he starts shooting randomly at different places out of desperation. He's breathing fast, and his gestures exhibit the fear of the unknown that haunts him. He cautiously walks toward the place, holding his gun at alert, when something startles him to his core. Later on, Ed, a mental health professional, is seen knocking on the door and asking for his sister, Lila. He enters the house and looks around. Suddenly, someone walks past him and exits the house. Ed enters a room and finds his sister on the bed in an inappropriate situation. Lila is furious at him for visiting her without informing her. He asks her to hear him out as he has something crucial to tell. Lila gets coffee for both of them, and they sit at the table. After remaining silent for a while, the conversation between them begins to heat up when he blurts out about Martin. Immediately, Lila's expression changes to concern. She asks her brother if Martin is doing fine, to which he replies that Martin is in the lakehouse and they have to get him. Ed has visited Lila to convince her to accompany him to the lakehouse. A recording from a voice call sounds like Martin's voice. His voice appears like he's suffering from extreme cold. His voice breaks up as he talks. Martin wants Ed to know that there is something near the lakehouse, but forbids Ed from visiting him. His voice is filled with horror, as if he is terrified of some entity. Unexpectedly, he starts to yell no, and the call ends there. Lila and Ed are sitting in a car, heading to Martin. They drive on an abandoned road and yearn to reach it before sunrise. Ed refuses the idea of stopping and keeps going further. They keep conversing to avoid dozing off. Lila also claims that Martin needs medical help. Ed strictly forbids her to speak about the doctor or Martin's sickness. Finally, they're near the lake house and reach a shop in the snowy field to buy something to erase their hunger. They enter the snow-covered area and keep proceeding on their journey. Ed takes several turns, and the area becomes less crowded until they reach the same abandoned place. They park in front of the house. They reach the door and knock on it. Ed calls out Martin, but nobody answers. Lila wonders why Martin has covered all the windows. She looks at the lake in front of the house. Ed keeps knocking, and suddenly, they hear a strange sound. They both stride toward the back door and start banging on it. After trying for several minutes, Ed takes out a key from his pocket and opens the door. Lila gets angry at Martin for keeping them waiting outside. As they enter, they notice that the door has been sealed with duct tape. They exchange glances, and both of them are baffled. It's pitch dark inside since all the windows are covered with thick papers. They keep calling his name, but hear nothing in reply. Ed finds a mess inside the kitchen and hears a scream. When he turns around, it is just the TV. Meanwhile, Lila is also looking for Martin. She finds a locked door with scratch marks on the door. Ed switches off the TV. Suddenly, Martin attacks them from behind with a rifle. He keeps yelling and asking if they are being followed. He quickly goes to the door and seals it again with the duct tape. Lila confirms that there's no one beside them. Martin starts to cry, and Ed tries to comfort him. Martin is angry because he asked Ed not to visit him. Ed asks him why he's carrying a gun with him, to which Martin replies that it is for protection. Ed asks him what he is protecting himself from, to which Martin responds hysterically. Martin does not seem to be in his senses. He cannot think straight, and whatever he says makes no sense. Ed shakes him and firmly asks what is bothering him. Martin replies that he found something in the forest that tore their dog apart. To this, Lila asks if it is the dog locked inside the back room. Suddenly, Martin goes hysterical again and attacks Lila, and forbids her to open the back room. Lila gets terrified and retreats from him. Ed asks him if he has someone held hostage in the back room, to which Martin responds that it's not in the back room, but in the basement. Ed wonders who Martin has held hostage in the cellar. Ed tells him they will be arrested for kidnapping someone. Martin simply replies that it's not someone. Instead, it is something. Ed raises his voice and inquires about the thing. Suddenly, Martin gets furious at Ed for inferring that he's mentally unstable and treating him like his patient. Martin claims to have found the proof of something and tells Ed that he cannot return to the clinic anymore. Martin has gone frantic. Ed warns him that he will make certain calls if he doesn't share what he's keeping in the basement. At last, Martin blurts out that he has captured the pod. Lila doesn't understand what he's talking about. Martin seems excited as he tells them he has the proof for pods. Martin informs them that the government sent the soldiers in the past, not for combat, but for some experiments. Lila inquires if it's like lab rats, to which he agrees. Martin narrates that he was experimented on with pills to keep him awake for 4 straight days. He claims that he had seen soldiers vomit and faint. At first, he thought it was about scaring the new recruits. But when Martin woke up inside what seemed like a lab one day, he saw something tearing a bigger guy apart. Lila asks him what it was. Martin says it was a new experiment of the government. It was something that resembled a human and a wild animal, a pod. He has seen the pod in the flesh, and one pod has also followed him. Ed is frustrated because of the nonsense Martin is speaking. Martin tells them that the government can use these pods to attack a certain place, as the pods don't leave any traces behind. The government has invented these creatures to do their dirty work without getting identified. Ed asks Martin how the pod found him, and he shows them something in his mouth. Martin had pulled out several of his teeth. Lila starts screaming in fear, and Ed looks away in disgust. Lila asks him if he did this to himself, to which Martin nods in excitement and tells them that he had to use pliers to get a tracking device out of his teeth. He believes that the government had planted the device in his tooth to track him down, which he had destroyed into pieces. He seems ecstatic as he describes how he plucked several teeth out of his mouth. Despite the pain he suffered, he still managed to get it out. He also shaved his head out of desperation. He picks up a tray from the table and shows Lila the pieces of his teeth. He asks her to see that one piece that has a medal attached to it. Lila inspects the piece closely. She agrees with Martin and calls Ed to see it. Ed is still unconvinced. Ed makes him remember someone called Edith. He asks him if she was really a spy from the army and feeding Martin arsenic. Martin starts to have flashbacks of a girl and some strange creature. He asks Ed to stop talking about her. Ed tells Martin that he had seen her some days before, and she still works there. He enlightens Martin about the scars he gave her. Ed tries to calm Martin down by stating that Martin is the victim of an organization. Ed assures him that he and Lila are there to help Martin and denies that some monster resides in the basement. Martin asks that if all this is just his imagination, then what about his fellows whom he witnessed passing away? Martin believes the sources are trying to eliminate evidence of their actions. As they are discussing, Lila is examining the broken tooth Martin had shown them. Ed wants Martin to leave the cabin and come with them for a drive. Martin is afraid for Lila and Ed's life. Ed is now getting annoyed because of Martin's nonsense. Martin keeps insisting on the pod inside the basement. Eventually, Ed yells at him that there's nothing down there. Martin reveals his chest with several wounds, like some wild animal has attacked him. Ed steps back in fear, as the wounds are all infected. Martin acts like an unstable person, and Ed is bewildered as to how he can harm him this severely. Martin complains about getting his vision affected because of the infection. Ed is taken aback by his condition as Martin tells him that there must be some poison in the creature's blood that has affected his body parts. Ed gets furious and leaves the room. He takes Lila out of the kitchen and tells her that they must talk. Lila glances at Martin as she sees his unstable body standing before the locked back door. Ed drags her to another room and discusses Martin's condition. Lila wonders if Martin is right, but Ed gets exasperated at her. He's afraid that Martin might have held some innocent individual hostage. Ed also fears that Martin may begin to consider Lila and him as government agents too, and may even try to harm them. Ed suggests that Martin's just making up stories to suppress the guilt about their parents' demise, and to get rid of the fact that he was kicked out of the army. Lila is baffled to hear this revelation. She asks Ed how Martin was kicked out of the army. Ed tells her that Martin was arrested for trying to steal a military tank from the base, and later, he attacked the nurse and tried to rip off her face. Martin gets out of the house cautiously and reaches the car. He breaks open the window, enters it, and opens up the hood. Then, Martin damages the wires inside it. He feels thrilled about his achievement. Suddenly, he sees something in the woods and watches with horror. Meanwhile, Ed and Lila are still inside the room discussing Martin's condition. Lila tries to digest the details she has been provided with. Ed is trying to convince Martin to visit his doctor. Lila is aware that Martin might not like this. Ed gives a solution to that as well. He shows her something, which leaves her terrified. He has brought a booster with him to sedate Martin. Lila doesn't like the idea of tranquilizing him. She reminds him that Martin has a loaded rifle with him, and he can blow their heads off. But Ed convinces her as it's their final resort. Moreover, Martin's doctor, Dr. Nick, also agrees with this solution. At that very moment, the door bursts open, and Martin enters. He is furious and uncontrollable after finding out that Dr. Nick knows about their whereabouts. Ed hides the injection just in time. Martin is losing his senses and suddenly takes a pocket knife out and slits his throat. Lila starts screaming, while Ed runs toward him to help. He instructs Lila to call the ambulance, while he presses the wound to stop the bleeding. She races out of the room to the phone and tries to call, but someone has cut off the wire. She returns to Ed and finds him trying to keep his brother alive, but he fails. They both begin to cry. He asks Lila about the ambulance, to which she responds that the phone wire has been cut off. He asks her if they must leave, but Lila gets furious that they cannot leave Martin's body there. Ed makes her realize the significance of reaching out to cops before the situation slips out of their hands. Suddenly, they hear a loud bang from the basement. Lila gets hysterical out of frustration and anger when Ed shuts her up. She asks him where he is going, and he replies that he has to check the basement and can't go to jail for captivating an innocent life. Ed cautiously descends the staircase, with Lila following him closely behind. They walk to the locked door and exchange glances before entering the room. Ed breaks open the door. As they enter, the room gives off a strange vibe. There is no light entering the room, and the space appears red because of the light bulb. It almost feels like an investigation room. Different drawings and newspapers are hanging on the walls. The door to the basement is locked and sealed with wooden planks. Ed stands before the door when he hears a loud bang. He tries to remove the planks and opens the door. The basement is completely dark. He calls out to the prisoner inside the basement, but nobody responds. Ed looks at Lila and then switches on his flashlight. He asks Lila to stay upstairs, and he goes down to check if someone is hurt. Lila does not want him to go down alone, but Ed is firm in his decision. He leaves her upstairs and descends the steps. Lila stands at the edge of the stairs, waiting for her brother. Ed cautiously goes down, flashing the light around. Suddenly, he hears something from his left side, and a scared Ed flashes his light toward the sound. He keeps flashing around to find someone. Lila calls Ed, but he asks her not to follow him. Finally, Ed sees a light bulb and switches it on, but as he turns it on, the whole house goes dark. Lila starts screaming because of the sudden darkness and questions about spotting anyone. He complains about the darkness and believes that he might have triggered the fuse box. Ed tries to search for the fuse box when suddenly someone appears and stands still in the corner. When he flashes the light on the corner, he finds nothing there. Ed opens the fuse box, and the lights come back. He switches on the basement lights as well. In a strange turn of events, Ed comes across a peculiar figure, resembling a human and some wild animal hybrid, standing before him. Ed starts screaming and tries to save himself from that creature. Lila keeps calling his name from the top of the stairs, but suddenly, everything goes silent except for Lila's cries. After a moment, Lila sees Ed trying to fight something. He exits the basement and shuts the door behind him. He lays his back against the door, trying to stop the creature from pursuing him. Lila keeps screaming and inquiring about the hidden reality down there. Ed gives her the car keys and asks her to leave the house immediately. Lila quickly goes to the car, but her luck runs out when she is unable to fire up the engine. After trying to ignite the engine a few more times, Lila hears Ed scream from the inside, and, out of desperation, she starts running away from the cabin. After running for a while, she spots another house nearby and begins to bang on the door, but no one responds. Suddenly, she sees a car passing by and starts running after it for help. Meanwhile, Ed is trying to close the door as the horrible creature tries to break it open. He keeps searching his pockets for something while trying to close the door simultaneously. After an intense effort, his hand reaches the same booster inside his pocket. He takes it out, but his hands are shaking, and the injection drops from his hand. He tries to reach it, and luckily, he picks it up, removes the lid, injects it into the creature, and closes the door behind him. Lila tries to stop the car and starts crying when it doesn't. Suddenly, she sees the vehicle slowing down. The man inside begins interrogating. Because of Lila's panicking condition, he thinks that she might have come across some accident. She pleads that he must help her as her brother is deceased inside the house. He asks about the cause of the demise. The man is wondering if her brother was attacked by some animal. However, she replies that her brother has been assassinated by some government experiment called POD. Suddenly, the driver pulls the gun out, says it's not a government experiment, and shoots her directly in the head. Lila drops down on the ground, deceased. The man exits the car and starts moving around. He picks up Lila's body and locks it inside the trunk. Ed is still inside the house, trying to block POD from coming toward him. He is breathless and starts having flashes in his head, like he's losing his mind. He immediately runs to the kitchen, refills the rifle, and shoots at something. He feels like something is following him, but the POD is not behind him. He keeps looking at the doorway when, suddenly, the POD enters. He immediately shoots it, and it drops to the ground. Ed keeps pointing the rifle at the pod. He loads it again, but there are no bullets left in the gun. Suddenly, the pod attacks him, and he butchers it with the back of the rifle. The blood spreads around the room, covering Ed in its blood too. Ed keeps hitting it with anger. He starts laughing, looking at he limps outside the cabin, calling for Lila, but she's nowhere to be seen. He keeps shouting that he assassinated the pod, but suddenly, the same man returns. He attacks and butchers Ed with gunshots. The man quietly creeps inside the cabin, finds the pod's body on the floor, and shouts in frustration. He starts talking to someone on the phone. He tells the person on the call that the locals have assassinated it. The unknown caller asks about survivors, to which the man denies. The caller asks the man to check in the woods for their society. As the conversation ends, the man hears a silent wail and turns around. He is dumbfounded as he sees the thing before him. Sometime later, a person is visiting the same place and finds Lila lying inside the trunk, Ed in the snow in front of the house, Martin inside the cabin, and the same driver who had assassinated Lila and Ed, all deceased. As he stands near the driver, he hears something moving inside the house. He looks around, and suddenly, the pod attacks from behind the wall, indicating that the peculiarity is very much alive.